Thank you for joining us for another episode of Hijrah Talk. My name is Timothy Caldis, and I'm your host. Joining us today is Ms. Cristine Albertin. She is the UNODC Regional Representative for the MENA region here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure having you. Today we're going to be talking about smuggling and trafficking of people and this phenomenon. And so if you could just, for our audience, kind of explain the difference and the distinction between trafficking and smuggling to help them understand what we're discussing.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Let me start by explaining a little bit where our office comes from. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is like a specialized organization within the UN that deals specifically with forms of organized crime, as is drug trafficking, which was the most known form of transnational organized crime in the late 80s, 90s. But then later the international community worldwide recognized that there are other forms of transnational organized crime developing, such as trafficking of human beings and smuggling of migrants. So to many this will sound like something very similar, but when we look at it from the perspective of criminalizing these conducts, because we have people who exploit other people, and it has to be established as a criminal offense, we have two differences. When we look at trafficking of people, actually we look at people that are being forced by force or by violence. They are being transported, recruited, harbored, or whatever is done with them for the purpose of exploitation. So the element of exploitation is part of the criminal offense of trafficking of human beings. While when we talk about smuggling of migrants, actually we talk about criminal groups that cross borders illegally, and they do this by facilitating this border crossing by using falsified documents, by fraud documents, and transporting migrants over the borders to a different country. It's considered a crime between two states. And the distinction was made because we know that many migrants want to move, so they are looking for services by people who can offer these services, but they are actually not victims because they willingly accept certain conditions of this transport. So this is why we had to have these two distinctions, and we have one convention that deals specifically with transnational organized crime, but with smuggling of migrants as an offense, and also trafficking of human beings as an offense, where again the element of exploitation is very important to identify the crime as such.
Yes, and so with trafficking there's also an element of coercion usually, right?
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly. Violence, coercion, abuse, and I mean we know all the stories about women who have been telling us about their painful, trajectory coming from maybe Nigeria, being lured into like a good job in Italy, being able to work somewhere in a nice hair salon and so on. And once they accept the offer, they are taken away the passport, which of course is taking away the liberty of the person to move, maybe being held somewhere, detained in a place that they cannot leave, not being free to move and so on. And then when they reach the final destination, they very often also find out that actually not a job at a hair salon, a beauty salon, which very often is the business that women look for, that actually this nice job is not waiting for them, but some brothel is actually waiting for them.
And when we hear about smuggling specifically, we often hear about stories that either involve people moving towards Europe or the United States. But your organization has identified something like 30 different smuggling routes all over the world. Is it a broader phenomenon that people aren't focusing on as much?
Yeah, exactly. No, I think, of course, in the media we hear more about the migrants that are drowning in the Mediterranean, which, of course, are terrifying images that we see. And then last weekend we also heard about this young father who drowned with his daughter on the border between Mexico and the US. No, actually, the smuggling of migrant phenomenon has become very, very prominent, and I think it has become very prominent and very visible to everybody with the flows of migrants and refugees out of Syria and Iraq 4 years ago. And after that, UNODC has been starting to do more research, which has led to this first report on smuggling of migrants. We don't have any other document like this first global study on smuggling of migrants. And in this report, we have found, as you said, 30 smuggling routes. And if you look at the map that has been published in this report, you find smuggling routes to Australia, from Southeast Asia, to South Asia, from South Asia to the Middle East, from North Africa to the Middle East, but also from from Eastern Africa to South Africa, from Southern Africa to North Africa to West Africa, then to North Africa to Europe. So there is now, we have a range of 30 smuggling routes, and I would not be surprised when we publish the next report that there will be more. And let me just add, we also produce a report on human trafficking. And the last human trafficking report actually identified 500 trafficking flows worldwide.
Wow, it's an enormous number.
It's an enormous number.
And what you're pointing out here is that not all the trafficking is a South-North phenomenon, or the smuggling, sorry, is a South-North phenomenon. There's also a lot of South-South smuggling that's happening as well.
That's true, that's true. And I think, yeah, I mean, when we look at a continent like Africa that is so diverse in itself, of course, Southern Africa, for example, is a very attractive area for many people who want to leave Eastern Africa or Western Africa, Western Africans trying to reach the Maghreb, North Africa. Not everybody necessarily wants to come to Europe. Or look at the Gulf states. They are very attractive for labor coming from South Asia, or also from the Middle East, from the region that I'm working on. So definitely it is not limited to Europe or to the US.
Could you please share with us some of the motivations for migrants seeking out smugglers and hiring them for their services?
Yeah, well, I think there is a series of factors that actually drive migrants to leave their country and maybe also to seek services. But I also would think that smugglers actually are also very smart in reaching out to migrants to get the services done. I think from the external, if we look at or let's rather start with the internal issues, I think why do people leave the country? It's usually because of conflict, armed conflict, and of course in the Middle East we have enough of that, but also in other parts of the world. Then there could be socio-economic hardship for many people. I think this is something that we discuss very much. Climate change, environmental degradation could be a reason why people want to leave. And I think we see, when I hear other colleagues from the UN who deal a lot with youth, we have some evidence of some countries where there have been studies done on the youth, and you find numbers as high as that 50% of the youth nowadays want to leave their country. I mean, this is really like terrifying that there are too many places in the world where people don't have any hope anymore that things will be improving in their own country. And I think if you have groups of populations that do not know, that do not have the resources, or who do not have the knowledge on how to travel, because we still have a large number of people who would not have a passport, who would need to know how to get a passport first, who do not have the money to buy a ticket, maybe do not even know how to travel abroad. So I think these people, of course, when you have a situation, despair coupled with this lack of knowledge and skills to know how to move, of course, if you then meet somebody who's offering you a very attractive package, you know, who can offer you a passport, a travel document, contacts en route, contacts in a different country and so on, then of course it's like the perfect match that is coming together. But of course the migrant is paying a very high price for it, and maybe also paying with a much higher price, being injured in the journey, being exploited in the journey, maybe even killed, be it on purpose or be it by accident. So I think there are a lot of risks that these migrants have to take.
Do you think that, I mean, you're talking about the different legal mechanisms. There's a sense by some that there isn't enough legal mechanisms and legal routes available, which is part of the reason why migrants opt for these smuggling routes instead. The cost of being smuggled is actually substantially higher than to travel regularly. So obviously it wouldn't be the first choice if there was another route. Can you speak to that a bit in terms of that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we all hear about the discussions that are going on, and I'm from Germany, so I mean, this is a very big discussion. I think last week our parliament looked at a law which will allow us to, which allow the entrance of more migrant workers into Germany. And I mean, this is not really under the purview of UNODC, but I mean, if I remember well, in Germany, the industry regularly publishes the need for labor in Germany. And looking at the demographics in Germany, we have a huge gap that we have to fill. It goes into the millions of vacancies and millions of vacancies that need to be filled in the new future. And the only possibility will be to allow people from other countries to come into Germany. So I think this discussion is very much there to look at how to prevent the smuggling of migrants, which of course is at the cost of the migrant also, because it can lead to a form of exploitation and to many other risks. But at the same time also to look how we can have better systems of legal migration for migrants. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is the value of the smuggling industry or the smuggling networks in terms of the amount of money that goes into it every year?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this study was very useful in that sense because we were able to establish that smuggling of migrants in 2016 created a business of $5.5 to $7 billion per year.
It's quite substantial.
Very substantial, and that was the same amount that the European Union and the US were putting into humanitarian aid. So I mean, just to give a sense of what is this size of amount. So we can see that this is something very attractive for smugglers to pursue.
Yeah, and to what extent does that substantial sum add to the challenge of combating smuggling?
Yeah, exactly, because I mean, all organized crime, all transnational organized crime is done because of the profit that it generates. And actually, this is exactly the point that my organization is working on, how we can dry up this business for whatever transnational organized crime. And I think we all have recognized if you go after the money, then of course this is the most effective way to dry up any transnational organized crime. But that comes with a lot of challenges. That means that government, state institutions, private sector, they must know what money laundering is and how to deal with it. And this is a very complex issue. It's a very complex crime. It's a second crime to the related crime, which is smuggling of migrants or trafficking in human beings. And considering that nowadays crimes are committed using the cyberspace, for example, and internet, it makes it very challenging for state institutions to get the perpetrators to justice.
And we're also seeing a shift in terms of the demographics of irregular migration. So UNHCR put out a report in 2015 that said that 13% of irregular migrants now are women and 18% were children. So we're seeing more women and children entering into irregular migration. How is that affecting the challenges? What unique challenges does that present in terms of addressing this issue and trying to keep people safe?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important question, and I think as for any other population group, when we deal with a population group, be it migrants, be it refugees, we always have to look at the specific needs of these populations. And I think in Germany or in Europe in general, we had a lot of stories about unaccompanied children, because it's not only about the children being part of the migration flows, but especially if they travel alone, when they have lost their parents, their families, and so on, or even they leave alone a country. And of course, these children are extremely vulnerable. They can very easily fall prey to any trafficker, for example, for exploitation. And the same is in a way also true for women, and women are especially vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Most of the human trafficking victims, especially women, the exploitation is due to sexual exploitation. So I think we need to have systems in place when you see the migration flows, the refugee flows, and you have the different institutions dealing with it, including IOM, UNHCR, whoever is on the ground, a lot of NGOs. They have to be trained to be sensitized to this, the possible risks that these women and children can be exposed to. And then be sensitized, be able to identify such children, for example, and then also be able to refer them to like specialized services. So like a refugee camp, if there can be like a special counselor, for example, a protection officer for children who knows what is the specific trauma, for example, that a child might have gone through, or what it might mean for the child to have lost the family and so on. So I think it's mainly sensitization of all the institutions that are involved, that deal with refugee and migration flows, and building up the respective services also.
And what kind of progress has been made in terms of building that capacity?
I think there's a lot of work being done. I know that our partner agencies, sister agencies, UNHCR and IOM, they are building up these services in the camps. But of course, I think there is a big risk when you are en route, because then you are basically alone, you are not accompanied.
Right. And with respect to the women and children who are traveling alone and do disappear upon arrival, Do we have an idea of the scale of that problem?
Well, I would not have numbers, but I think it is quite important. And I know about some NGOs that are working like in Greece and in Italy who have been working with such children, who are offering like shelter homes for these children, and they can give testimony to that. I think it's a really big concern. And I remember in 2015 when the big number of refugees reached Europe, and some of the countries felt they cannot absorb, some of the countries that really were very generous in accepting refugees. I remember, for example, Sweden said very clearly, we have to focus on the unaccompanied children. So if we look at the entire refugee population that is coming, we really have to give priority to the unaccompanied children because they are the most vulnerable ones.
And since then, we have seen more restrictions on migration and lower quotas for accepting, for example, refugees. To what extent has that added pressure in terms of the smuggling and the demand for smuggling globally?
Well, I'm not so sure if numbers, I think numbers have gone down reaching Europe, so I'm not so sure that there is more pressure. I think, of course, there is a major concern, since we talk a lot about Europe, is to manage properly the borders and to ensure that there is orderly and safe migration. And I think one of the major concerns, of course, has to be to prevent all this drowning in the Mediterranean. Because, I mean, if you look at the numbers are still very high of people who have drowned in the Mediterranean because of this dangerous smuggling, the boats that are being used, and so on. So I think, of course, we follow up to this discussion. And, well, I mean, I think how to distribute the refugees within the European Union is a continuous discussion. I don't think it has stopped. I think the countries who have been accepting refugees will also insist that all the countries that form the European Union also and share the same values will also do what they are supposed to do. So I see that there's a big discussion still going on. And actually, I can say as a German, I'm happy to see that we have some German NGOs, that go out and continue to save migrants. And
those NGOs right now are coming under a lot of pressure, we're hearing. Is there any indication that these sort of efforts, though, are kind of crucial for protecting people who are being smuggled and trafficked? Is there a lack of other governmental capacity to address this issue, and they're filling a gap, or? Well,
if we talk about the drowning, I would not make a difference between smuggled migrants or trafficked victims. I think in general, the issue of smuggling of migrants and trafficking of human beings has gained quite some importance, worldwide and visibly also on the political agenda. If I can just give an example, if you look at our last report on human trafficking, we have now more than, I think, 130 countries that have adopted legislation against human trafficking. This has all happened in the last 10 to 15 years. If you look back 15 years ago, we didn't have any legislation. And that allows the criminal justice institutions also to identify the perpetrators and to prosecute them and bring them, to justice. And it is not only dealing with the perpetrators, it is also dealing with giving the appropriate shelter, the appropriate support to the victims that have been rescued. And that support has to be not only legally or medically, it also has to be psychologically. And of course, after that, we also need services to rehabilitate the victims, reintegrate them, sometimes repatriate them, and so on. I think there is quite some work going on in Europe, but also in the region that I'm working for. And actually, we are working very much with the governments to help build these capacities.
Well, that's good to hear, and I hope you have as much success as possible.
Yeah, I hope so too, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you also for joining us on this episode of Hijrah Talk. Again, I'm your host, Timothy Caldas, and I hope to see you next time.